The rain over the harbor smelled like salt and diesel and something older than both, and I was the only person foolish enough to be standing on the pier without an umbrella, watching the water climb the pilings one slow inch at a time. That is where this story begins. Not on some ordinary morning, not with an alarm clock or a cup of coffee going cold on a counter, but with me, Freddie Gordon, 26 years old, soaked to the bone. Wondering why I always ended up in places that mirrored whatever mess was happening inside my own chest. I want to tell you, before anything else, what kind of world I lived in, because it matters for everything that comes after. Ours was a world split cleanly into three kinds of people: alphas, who carried the weight of command in their bones whether they wanted it or not; betas, who moved through life mostly unnoticed by the biology that ruled the rest of us, free in a way I used to envy; and omegas like me, built for something the textbooks called nurture, and the old poems called grace. Though grace never felt like the right word when you were doubled over with a heat cramp at 19, missing 3 days of work because your body had decided without asking you that this month it wanted a family you didn't have. Omega pregnancy was not impossible. It was just rare enough that when it happened, entire towns talked about it for a year. Rare enough that Omega men carried a strange kind of hope and a strange kind of grief in the same breath. Because most of us went our whole lives with the biological possibility and never once with the fact of it. My mother told me not to build my future around a maybe. She said it gently, the way you tell a child that the lottery ticket in their hand is probably not a winner. But you let them hold on to it anyway because hope costs nothing and it warms small hands on cold nights. I did not go to that pier because I was pregnant. I went there because I had just watched my best friend's wedding from a folding chair in the third row. Watched two betas promise each other forever with the kind of certainty that never seemed to be in the cards for me, and I had needed air that didn't smell like champagne and other people's happiness. That was where Clint Dean found me, though. Found is too gentle a word for what he actually did, which was nearly run me over with his bicycle because he wasn't watching where he was going any more than I was. "You're going to fall in," he said, not as a greeting, just as a fact. The way you'd tell someone their shoe was untied. I turned around and there he was, dripping just as badly as I was, hair plastered flat to his forehead, an alpha's build under a soaked gray sweater, and eyes that were doing something complicated when they landed on me. Not the usual alpha once over, the cataloging stare so many of them gave omegas without even realizing they were doing it. He looked at my face first. That was the thing I noticed even before I noticed how tall he was. Even before the scent that reached me through the rain, warm and dark like cedar smoke. The kind of scent that made something old and quiet in me sit up and pay attention. "I'm aware of the tide," I said, because apparently my mouth needed to prove it wasn't afraid of him, even if the rest of me wasn't so sure. "I'm not going to fall in." "You looked like you might jump in on purpose, which is worse." That startled a laugh out of me, short and surprised, the first one I'd managed all day. He smiled like he'd won something small and important. We stood there while the rain came down around us, two strangers with no reason to keep talking and every reason to walk away, and neither of us walked away. I would learn, over the months that followed, that this was simply who Clint was. He did not walk away from things. Not from stubborn horses at the ranch his family ran 2 counties over, not from arguments he believed in, and, as it turned out, not from a rain-soaked omega who barked at him about tides on the worst best day of his life. We ended up under the awning of a closed bait shop, sharing the kind of silence that should have been awkward and instead felt like something being built, brick by brick, without either of us laying down blueprints first. He told me his name, I told him mine. He said Freddie Gordon like it was a sentence worth finishing slowly, and something in my stomach turned over in a way it hadn't in longer than I wanted to admit. "You were at the wedding," he said. "Inside, I saw you leave." "You were watching me leave a wedding you were also at?" "I know the groom from college. I didn't know anyone else there." Watching you leave was more interesting than watching people dance to a song none of us actually like. I should have found that presumptuous. Instead, I found it painfully honest, the kind of honesty that either meant someone was too tired to lie or too sure of themselves to bother. With Clint, I would learn, it was always the second one, and it took me embarrassingly long to realize that his certainty wasn't the alpha arrogance I'd been braced for my whole life. It was something quieter. He simply already knew what he wanted, and he was patient about waiting for the rest of the world to catch up to him. That night ended with a phone number written in wet ink on a torn piece of a bait shop receipt, ink already starting to bleed into unreadable smudges by the time I got home. I stared at that ruined little scrap for 20 minutes before I could make out enough of the digits to try. He picked up on the second ring, like he'd been waiting with the phone already in his hand, which, he confessed months later, he absolutely had been. The weeks that followed had a shape to them I can still trace with my eyes closed, even now. Coffee that turned into dinner, dinner that turned into long drives with the windows down because Clint said cars felt too small for the kind of talking we did, talking that stretched past midnight and into the kind of tired laughter that comes only when you've forgotten to watch the clock. He worked with his hands out at his family's ranch, and it showed in the calluses along his palms and the sun-worn color across his forearms. But it showed more in the way he moved through the world, unhurried, deliberate, like he trusted his own decisions enough not to need to rush them. I worked in a bookstore that smelled like dust and old glue, 3 streets over from the harbor, a job that paid little and gave me everything else I actually wanted out of a day. He liked to come by after closing and sit on the front step, while I locked up, waiting without impatience, the porch light catching gold in eyes that were, if I am being honest, the first thing about him that undid me completely. There is a version of this story where I tell you the courtship was easy, uncomplicated, free of the fear that colors every Omega's love life whether we admit it aloud or not. That would be a lie, and I promised myself, sitting down to tell this, that I would not lie, not even to smooth the edges. The truth is that I was afraid of him for longer than I want to confess. Not afraid the way you fear a stranger in a dark alley, but afraid the way you fear something that could actually break you. Because the things that can break us are always the things we let close enough to matter. Alphas had hurt Omegas I loved. My own uncle had spent 3 years married to a man who mistook the word alpha for the word owner, and I had watched what that mistake did to someone I cared about. Watched it hollow him out slow and quiet until there was a stranger living behind his eyes. I did not want that. I told myself I would rather be alone forever than risk becoming that hollowed-out stranger myself. Clint never pushed. That was, I think, the exact thing that dismantled every wall I had built. He never once asked me for anything I wasn't already offering. When I flinched early on at an unexpected hand near my shoulder, he didn't apologize with the performative guilt some people use to make themselves feel better. He just stepped back, gave me room, and waited for me to close the distance myself, which I eventually did, over and over, until closing that distance became the easiest thing I had ever done. "I'm not in a hurry," he told me once, on a night when I had finally worked up the nerve to ask him why he was so patient with someone as guarded as me. We were sitting on the tailgate of his truck outside my apartment, the sky doing something violet and orange that neither of us was paying attention to. "I've got a whole life to spend figuring you out. I'd rather do it right than do it fast." I didn't say anything back. I couldn't. I just leaned my head against his shoulder and let the quiet do the talking for both of us, and he let his arm come around me slow, like he was asking permission with the gesture instead of assuming it. That was Clint Dean in a single motion, asking, even when the answer was already written all over my face. Heats are a private thing, something Omegas are taught from adolescence to guard fiercely, and I had spent my whole adult life managing mine alone, suppressants and blackout curtains and a phone left off the hook. Because being alone through the worst of it always felt safer than needing someone who might not stay. The first time I let Clint anywhere near a heat of mine, it wasn't planned, and it terrified me more than anything else in our entire relationship up to that point. My suppressants had failed. a batch mislabeled at the pharmacy, and by the time I realized what was happening, I had maybe an hour before my body turned into something I couldn't fully control. I called him because he was the only name in my phone that didn't feel like a mistake to call, and because some small traitorous, hopeful part of me wanted him there, even while the rest of me was screaming that this was reckless. He didn't touch me that night. I need you to understand that clearly, because it says everything about who he was. He sat outside my bedroom door with his back against the wood, talking to me through the gap at the bottom, asking what I needed, bringing water and cool cloths, and leaving them just inside the door without ever crossing the threshold I hadn't invited him past. I cried that night from the fever and the ache, and also from something else entirely, some old wound in me finally beginning, just barely, to close. You could have left, I told him afterward. Once the worst of it had passed and I'd showered and dressed and could look at him without my whole body trembling. Where would I have gone, he said, like the question itself didn't make sense to him. You needed someone on the other side of that door. I wasn't going to be somewhere else. It was after that night that I let myself believe, really believe, that this thing between us might be built to last. Trust, for an Omega who has spent a lifetime bracing for disappointment, is not a door that swings open all at once. It creaks open a hinge at a time, and Clint Dean earned every single hinge, one patient night at a time, until the day came when there was no door left between us at all. We bonded on a night in late autumn under a sky so full of stars it looked unreal, out past the tree line at the edge of his family's ranch, where he'd taken me to see the meteor shower everyone in town had been talking about for weeks. I won't pretend the bonding was some grand, choreographed event. It happened the way the truest things usually do, quietly, inevitably, two people who had already given each other everything that mattered, simply making it official in the way our biology allowed. His mark on my neck healed into something I would touch, unconsciously, for months afterward, a small physical proof that I was chosen and had chosen back. I felt him differently after that night. A low, warm hum at the edge of my awareness that I later learned was simply what a bond felt like. The two of us tethered now, in a way neither distance nor time could fully undo. There was a stretch of time, somewhere in that first winter, when I nearly ruined everything myself, out of nothing more than old fear dressed up as caution. It came in the shape of a man named Desmond, an alpha who had known Clint since boyhood, who showed up at a bonfire one of his cousins threw and spent the whole evening standing just a little too close, laughing just a little too easily at things that weren't especially funny, watching Clint with the kind of familiarity that made something ugly and unfamiliar rise up in my chest. I did not have a name for it at first. I only knew that by the time we drove home that night, I had gone quiet in a way Clint noticed immediately, because he noticed everything about me by then. The way you notice weather changing before the first drop of rain actually falls. "You've gone somewhere," he said, glancing over at me at a red light, his hand finding mine on the seat between us out of old habit. "I'm fine." "You're not fine. You've been not fine since we left the bonfire." He didn't push further than that, just waited, the way he always waited, patient enough that eventually the silence itself became harder to sit in than the truth would have been. "Desmond looks at you like he already knows what your mornings look like," I finally admitted, hating how small and jealous the words sounded once they were actually out in the air between us. Like there's a version of you I haven't met yet that he already has. Clint didn't laugh at me, which I think is the exact reason I didn't spiral any further than I already had. He pulled the truck over to the shoulder of the empty road, put it in park, and turned to face me fully. His expression, serious in a way that told me he understood this, mattered more than the jealousy alone would suggest. "Desmond and I grew up together," he said slowly. "We fought over a girl once when we were 15, and neither of us won her, and it's been a joke between us ever since. That's the whole history. There's no version of me he has access to that you don't. I promise you that." He paused, studying my face in the dim glow of the dashboard lights. "But I think this isn't really about Desmond, is it?" I hadn't wanted him to see that clearly. It was, of course, exactly right. It wasn't about Desmond at all. It was about every story I'd absorbed since childhood, about Omegas who trusted too easily and woke up one day to find the ground had shifted underneath them without warning, about my uncle's hollowed-out eyes. About a fear so old it had roots deeper than this particular relationship, deeper than Clint himself. I keep waiting for the version of you that isn't patient with me anymore, I admitted, my voice cracking on the words in a way that embarrassed me. I keep waiting for you to get tired of being careful. Clint was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had gone rough at the edges. Freddie, I need you to hear this, and I need you to actually believe it, not just nod along and keep the fear tucked away where I can't see it. I am not going to become a different person once you've let your guard all the way down. The patience isn't a performance I'm going to get tired of maintaining. It's just who I am. It's who I've always been, with you and with everyone else too, if you asked around. People change. Some do. Some do. I won't pretend otherwise, because you'd know I was lying and it wouldn't do either of us any good. But I've had 28 years to become whoever I was going to become, and this is it. This steady, unhurried, sometimes admittedly boring version of me is the whole of what you're getting. I'm not hiding some faster fused version underneath, waiting for the right moment to show up. I cried a little, right there on the shoulder of that empty road, not from sadness exactly, but from the strange, disorienting relief of being fully known and not punished for it. Clint didn't try to fix the tears or rush them along. He simply held my hand and let me have them, the same way he'd let me have every hard feeling since the night he'd sat outside my locked door. It was after that conversation that I finally let the last of my guard down completely. Not because Clint had done anything differently, but because I had finally allowed myself to believe that he never would. Marriage came 7 months later, small and unhurried, in the same way everything with Clint had always been. We didn't invite the whole town. We invited the people who mattered, his parents, who had taken to me faster than I expected. My mother, who cried through the entire ceremony and blamed it unconvincingly on allergies, and a handful of friends who had watched the whole slow unfolding of us from the very beginning. I remember standing across from him under a string of lights his sister had hung between 2 fence posts. Remember the way his hands were shaking slightly when he took mine. Remember thinking that I had spent my whole life being told not to hope for too much, and here I was hoping for everything and somehow being handed all of it anyway. We built a life in the months after that felt, for the first time in my memory, entirely uncomplicated. A little house on the edge of his family's land, close enough to the ranch that I could hear the horses some mornings, far enough that it felt like ours and no one else's. I kept working at the bookstore. He kept working the land. We were, by any measure, happy, in the ordinary, unremarkable way that happiness usually looks from the outside and feels enormous from the inside. Neither of us talked much about children in those early months, not because we didn't want them, but because we both understood, without needing to say it aloud, how rare an Omega pregnancy actually was. I had grown up hearing the statistics recited like scripture. A small fraction of Omega men would ever conceive in their lifetime, and of that small fraction, most would conceive once, if at all. I had made my peace with that fact long before I ever met Clint. I told myself, and meant it, that a life with him would be enough on its own, children or not. So when the exhaustion started, deep in the bones in a way that no amount of sleep seemed to touch, I chalked it up to the long hours at the store during the holiday rush. When certain smells started turning my stomach, the particular sharpness of coffee grounds, the leather polish Clint used on his boots, I told myself it was a stomach bug making its slow rounds through town. It was my mother, of all people, calling to check in on the holidays, who first asked the question neither of us had thought to ask. "You sound tired, baby. Are you eating enough? You're not late for anything, are you?" I laughed it off at first, and then I sat with the question longer than I meant to, doing the quiet arithmetic of dates in my head, counting backward through weeks that had blurred together in the happy haze of newlywed life, and felt something in my chest go very still and very loud all at once. I did not tell Clint right away. I want to be honest about that because I think it matters. I bought the test alone at a pharmacy 2 towns over where no one would recognize me, and I sat on the edge of our bathtub with my hands pressed flat against my thighs, waiting out the longest 3 minutes of my entire life, rehearsing in my head all the ways I might explain a negative result to myself, because I had already decided somewhere in the back of my mind that a negative result was the only realistic outcome. It was not negative. I stared at that little plastic stick for so long, the lines blurred and doubled in my vision, and my first coherent thought, once the roaring in my ears quieted down enough for thought to happen at all, was that I needed to sit down properly, because my knees had apparently decided they no longer wanted to hold me upright. I did not cry right away. The crying came later, in waves, unpredictable and overwhelming. The kind of crying that comes from a place too deep for words to reach first. What came first was a kind of disbelieving stillness, the sense of standing at the edge of a life I had spent years telling myself I wasn't allowed to want too badly, and finding it suddenly, impossibly, real. I told Clint that evening, over dinner, though telling isn't quite the right word for what actually happened. I set the test down on the table between us, face up next to the salt shaker, like it was the most natural thing in the world. And I watched him go very quiet in a way I had never seen from him before. "Freddie," he said, and his voice cracked clean down the middle on the second syllable of my name. "I know," I said, because I didn't trust myself to say anything more complicated than that. He came around the table so fast, his chair nearly went over, and then his arms were around me. And he was saying my name again and again into my hair, like it was the only word he still remembered how to form. And I felt him shaking, actually shaking this steady, unshakable man who had sat outside a locked door all through the worst night of my heat without ever once losing his composure. He was crying too, I realized, when I finally pulled back far enough to look at his face, and something about that undid me more completely than anything else that whole impossible evening. "We're going to have a baby," he said, like he needed to hear the words out loud to believe them himself. "We're going to have a baby," I repeated, and for the first time since I'd seen those 2 lines, I let myself smile. Quick pause here. If you want to watch our videos early with 0 ads or get access to exclusive videos, our Patreon has you covered, link in the description. Alright, back to where things get interesting. The early appointments were a blur of nerves and cautious hope, the kind of hope you hold with both hands because you're afraid of what happens if you drop it. Omega pregnancies carried risks that betas simply didn't face, our bodies working overtime to accommodate something we weren't originally built for in the same straightforward way, and every doctor we saw in those first weeks used careful, measured language, the kind meant to protect a patient's heart as much as their body. Dr. Alvarez became a fixture in our lives quickly, a soft-spoken beta woman who had, as she told us on our first visit, delivered exactly 4 Omega pregnancies in her entire career, and considered each one something close to a small miracle. She was thorough in a way that made me trust her instantly, checking and rechecking everything, never rushing through an appointment even when the waiting room outside filled up with other patients. It was at the 8-week appointment that everything changed again, in a way I don't think either of us was prepared for, no matter how many times we told ourselves we were ready for anything. Dr. Alvarez had gone quiet during the ultrasound. Quiet in a way that made my stomach drop, with a fear I couldn't name, moving the wand, slowly angling the screen away from us for a moment while she looked closer, murmuring something to her assistant that I couldn't quite catch. "Is something wrong?" Clint asked, his hand tightening around mine where it rested on the exam table between us, his voice carefully, even in a way that told me he was working hard to keep it that way. "Nothing is wrong," Dr. Alvarez said, and then she smiled, the first real smile I'd seen from her all appointment, and turned the screen toward us properly. "Nothing is wrong at all. I just wanted to make sure before I said anything, because this isn't something I get to say very often." She pointed to the screen, to 2 distinct shapes where I had only been expecting one, and it took my brain a long, stretching moment to understand what I was looking at. "You're carrying twins, Freddie," she said. 2 heartbeats, strong ones, both of them. I don't remember exactly what sound I made. Clint told me, later, that I made no sound at all for almost 10 full seconds, which he said was somehow more alarming than crying would have been. What I remember is the way the room seemed to tilt slightly and then right itself, the way Clint's grip on my hand went from steady to nearly bruising in his shock, and the way Dr. Alvarez kept talking gently about how genuinely rare this was. Twin conception in Omega pregnancy being rarer still than the pregnancies themselves, something she said she had read about in journals more often than she had ever witnessed firsthand. Twins, Quint said, testing the word out loud like he needed to hear himself say it to make it real. We're having twins. We're having twins, I echoed, and then finally the tears came fast and unstoppable, and Clint was crying too, right there in the exam room. And Dr. Alvarez was laughing softly and reaching for the tissues she clearly kept close for exactly this kind of appointment. The days after that appointment felt suspended somehow, unreal in the particular way that enormous good news can feel unreal before it has time to settle into the ordinary rhythm of a life. We told our family separately, wanting to watch each reaction unfold in its own moment rather than crowd them all into one overwhelming afternoon. My mother cried so hard on the phone that I had to hold mine away from my ear for a moment, and then she laughed through the crying and told me she'd known somehow, from the sound of my voice the first time we'd talked after the wedding, that something enormous was coming for me, something she couldn't have named but had felt anyway, mother's intuition being its own strange kind of biology. Clint's parents drove out the same evening we told them, his mother arriving with a casserole she'd apparently thrown together in the 20 minutes between our phone call and their arrival, because she said this was clearly a house that needed feeding right now, and she wasn't going to wait for an invitation. His father, a quiet man who rarely showed much on his face, sat down heavily in our kitchen chair and put his hand over his mouth for a long moment before he could speak at all. Twins, he said finally, looking at Clint like he was seeing his son fully for the first time in years. You're going to have your hands full, son. We're going to have our hands full, Clint corrected gently, reaching for my hand across the table, and his father's eyes went soft in a way I hadn't seen from him before, and he nodded once, like something important had just been settled between the two of them, without needing further words. There was a strange kind of attention that came with being visibly, publicly, and Omega-carrying twins in a town small enough that everyone eventually heard everything. People I barely knew stopped me on the street to offer congratulations, to ask questions, to touch my growing stomach, without always asking first, which Clint, in his quiet way, began gently intercepting before I even had to say anything myself. A steady hand at the small of my back. A polite but firm redirection of the conversation. Protecting a boundary I hadn't even realized I needed protected until he was already doing it. You don't have to let anyone touch you that doesn't feel right, he told me one evening, after a particularly overbearing encounter with a neighbor at the grocery store. Not even if they mean well. Especially not if they mean well and don't ask. I loved him for 100 reasons by that point in our life together, but I think that particular sentence said so simply over a kitchen counter while he was chopping vegetables for dinner was one of the moments that settled something permanently in my chest. He saw me, completely, in a way that had nothing to do with the pregnancy and everything to do with who I had always been underneath it. The second trimester brought its own particular difficulties, the kind the books didn't prepare either of us for, because most of the books about Omega pregnancy were written with singleton pregnancies in mind and twins, as Dr. Alvarez reminded us gently, and often were an entirely different conversation. I grew tired in ways that frightened me, sometimes a bone-deep exhaustion that no amount of rest seemed to touch, and there were nights when Clint would find me sitting on the edge of our bed, hands pressed to the curve of my stomach, crying without being entirely sure why, the hormones and the fear and the overwhelming enormity of what was happening inside me all tangled together into something too big for words. "Talk to me," he'd say, sitting down beside me, never pushing, just present, the same patience he'd shown me from that very first rain-soaked night on the pier. "I'm scared," I told him one particular night, further along than I liked to admit I'd been holding this fear in silence. What if something happens? What if my body can't actually do this? What if the doctors were wrong to be so hopeful? What if I fail them before they even get the chance to exist properly in the world? Clint didn't rush to reassure me the way some people might have, with easy platitudes meant more to end the conversation than to actually address the fear underneath it. He sat with the weight of what I'd said for a long moment, his hand resting over mine on my stomach, and when he finally spoke, his voice was steady in the way that had always anchored me. "You're not going to fail them," he said. "And if something does go wrong, it won't be because you failed at anything. Your body is doing something most bodies never get the chance to do at all. That's not failure, Freddie. That's about as far from failure as anything gets. But the risks, I know the risks. I've read everything Dr. Alvarez gave us, probably more times than you have. I know this is harder for an omega body carrying twins than for most pregnancies. I'm not going to pretend that's not true, because you'd know I was lying and it wouldn't help either of us anyway." He paused, and when he continued, his voice had gone rougher at the edges. "But I also know you. I've watched you push through things that would have broken people twice your size. You are the strongest person I have ever known. And I'm not just saying that because you're carrying my children. I was saying it about you long before there were any children to speak of." I don't think I have ever loved him more than I did in that exact moment, sitting on the edge of our bed at 11 o'clock at night, both of us, a little tearful. Both of us afraid in our own separate ways and choosing deliberately to be afraid together instead of alone. There is a particular ritual among omegas, old and mostly unspoken, called nesting, and I had heard about it my whole life without ever expecting to experience it myself. It arrived somewhere in my 6th month, sudden and consuming, an overwhelming need to prepare, to arrange, to make our home into something safe enough to hold the enormity of what was coming. I rearranged the nursery 3 times in a single week, dissatisfied each time in ways I couldn't fully articulate, moving the 2 cribs closer together and then farther apart and then closer again, folding and refolding tiny clothes that felt impossibly small in my hands, clothes that would soon belong to 2 entire separate people who didn't exist yet, outside the confines of my own body. Clint never once complained about any of it, even when I woke him at 2 in the morning, because I'd suddenly become convinced the nursery curtains were the wrong shade of blue. Even when I made him carry furniture back and forth across the house more times than either of us could count. He simply did whatever I asked, patient, in the particular way that I had come to understand as fundamentally, unshakably him, and somewhere in the middle of all that chaotic nesting, I found him one evening sitting alone in the half-finished nursery in the rocking chair his mother had given us, just looking around at the space with an expression on his face I didn't have a name for. "What are you thinking about?" I asked, easing myself carefully into the space beside the chair, my stomach making graceful movement and increasingly distant memory. "I'm thinking about how strange it is," he said slowly, "that a few months ago this room was just an empty space where we kept boxes we hadn't unpacked yet, and now it's going to be where 2 entire people spend the beginning of their whole lives. I keep trying to imagine them, what they'll look like, whether they'll have your eyes or mine, whether they'll fight over toys or share everything without being asked. Whether they'll like you or find you deeply embarrassing," I offered, and he laughed, the sound filling up the small unfinished room in a way that made it feel, suddenly, a little more like it was already home. "Probably both, depending on the day," he admitted. "I just want them to be safe and happy, and I want you to be safe through all of it, more than I've ever wanted anything." I reached down and took his hand, pressed it flat against the curve of my stomach where just then something shifted small and definite. A tiny foot or elbow, announcing its presence to the world in the only language it currently had available. Clint went very still, and then his whole face broke open into something so unguarded, so entirely without armor, that I felt my own eyes sting with sudden tears. "Was that?" "That was one of them saying hello, I think." "Hello," he said softly, bending down to speak directly to my stomach, his voice dropping into a register I'd never heard him use before, tender in a way that had nothing performative about it at all. "I'm your dad. I already love you both so much. It's a little embarrassing, honestly, but you'll understand eventually." I sat there in that half-finished nursery, watching the man I had bonded my whole life to talking softly to two children who didn't exist yet outside my own body, and I thought with a clarity that surprised me, that whatever fear I still carried about the road ahead, I would walk every single step of it, because I would never not, for a single moment, walk it alone. The complication, when it came, arrived without warning, the way the worst things always seem to. I was 31 weeks along, further than either twin pregnancies statistically tended to reach without early delivery, and Dr. Alvarez had begun, cautiously, to speak in more hopeful terms about how close we might actually get to full term. I woke one morning with a pain low in my back that I initially dismissed as ordinary discomfort, the kind that had become a familiar companion over the preceding months. By mid-afternoon, the pain had sharpened into something I couldn't ignore any longer, accompanied by a tightness across my stomach that felt different from the practice contractions I'd been warned about and had, so far, handled without much difficulty. Clint was out at the ranch when I called him, and I heard, even through the tinny distance of the phone connection, the exact moment his voice shifted from casual to alert. "Stay where you are," he said. "I'm coming right now. Call Dr. Alvarez's office and tell them what's happening. I'll be there in 10 minutes. He made it in 8. I know, because I counted every single one of them sitting on the edge of our bed with one hand pressed hard against my stomach, trying to breathe through the tightening pain the way the books had told me to. Trying not to let the fear show too plainly on my face when he burst through the door, because some old part of me still believed foolishly that staying calm for him was more important than admitting how frightened I actually was. He didn't buy the calm for a second. He never did, with me. He took one look at my face and dropped to his knees in front of me, taking both my hands in his, and said low and steady, "We're going to the hospital right now, and everything is going to be fine, and I am not leaving your side for one single second. Do you understand me?" The drive to the hospital is a blur I've never fully been able to reconstruct in my memory. Fragments of streetlights and Clint's white-knuckled grip on the steering wheel and his other hand reaching over every few seconds to check that I was still breathing, still present, still there beside him. Preterm labor. The doctors called it once we arrived, and I was examined properly, and the next several hours passed in a haze of medication meant to slow things down, meant to buy the twins more time inside me before the world outside became necessary. I remember the fear on Clint's face more clearly than almost anything else from that stretch of hours, a fear he was trying so hard to keep from me and failing at almost entirely, because I knew him too well by then to be fooled by his careful composure. "Talk to me," I said at one point, echoing back the words he'd given me so many times before, and he let out a breath that shook audibly on its way out. "I'm terrified," he admitted, his forehead pressed against our joined hands. "I've never been this terrified in my whole life. I keep thinking about everything that could go wrong, and I don't know how to just push that away like I usually do for you. Because this time it's real, and it's happening right now, and there's nothing I can actually do except sit here." "You're doing something," I told him, my own voice hoarse from the strain of the last several hours. "You're right here. That's not nothing, Clint. That's everything." The labor slowed eventually in response to the medication, and Dr. Alvarez arriving specially, despite the late hour, because she refused to hand this particular case to anyone else, explained that we had bought time. Though how much time remained uncertain, I was to remain in the hospital under close watch for as long as it took, and Clint, when told visiting hours technically ended at 9, simply looked at the nurse with an expression that made her decide, quite sensibly, not to argue the point any further. 4 days. That was how long the twins waited, once labor had first threatened, before deciding, all at once, in the middle of a night, I will remember with total clarity for the rest of my life, that they were finally ready. 31 weeks and 4 days is early by any measure, but not so early that the doctors' faces carried the same grave weight they might have carried at 28 or 26. Still, when the contractions returned that night, stronger and closer together than before, refusing every attempt to slow them this time, I felt a fear unlike anything I had experienced in the whole of the pregnancy so far. A fear that had nothing abstract left in it at all. Clint was there, of course. He had barely left the hospital in 4 days, sleeping in the uncomfortable chair beside my bed, showering in the tiny attached bathroom, eating whatever the vending machine offered because he refused to go far enough to find anything better. When the real labor began, he was already holding my hand before I'd even fully registered what was happening. "It's time," I said through gritted teeth as another contraction rolled through me sharper than the last, and I watched him go pale and steady all at once. The particular combination of fear and resolve that I had come to associate with him more than with any other person I had ever known. "I'm right here," he said, and then, because apparently even in the middle of active labor he could not resist making me laugh, "I'm not going anywhere, even if you tell me to. I've decided you don't get a say in that particular decision anymore." I laughed, and then the laugh turned into something closer to a sob as another contraction hit, and he was there through every single one of them. After that, his voice low and constant in my ear. Counting breaths, with me wiping the sweat from my forehead, absorbing without complaint, the crushing grip of my hand whenever the pain peaked. Dr. Alvarez had assembled what felt like an entire small army of medical staff by the time things moved into their final stretch. The room filling with quiet, competent activity, everyone aware. In the particular hushed way medical professionals get when something rare is unfolding in front of them, that this delivery mattered beyond the ordinary weight every delivery already carries. I will not pretend the birth itself was anything other than the hardest thing I have ever done. There were moments in the middle of it when I did not think I had anything left, when the exhaustion and the pain tangled together into something that felt genuinely insurmountable, and it was Clint's voice, steady and unwavering. That pulled me back each time from the edge of giving up. "You are so close," he told me, somewhere in the depths of it, his forehead pressed against mine, his own face wet with tears he wasn't bothering to hide anymore. "You are the strongest person I have ever known, and you are so close, and I am not letting you quit on me now." The first twin arrived at 3047 in the morning, small and furious and screaming with a strength that made the entire room briefly erupt into relieved, exhausted laughter. "A boy," the nurse announced, lifting him just long enough for me to see before whisking him to the waiting team for the checks every early arrival required. "One down," Dr. Alvarez said, her own voice tight with something that wasn't quite professional detachment anymore. "Freddie, I need you to give me a little more." The second ones turned slightly. "I want to help them along, but I need you to keep pushing when I tell you to." I don't remember exactly what I said in response. Clint told me later that what I actually said was something entirely unrepeatable, and that it had made even Dr. Alvarez laugh despite the tension of the moment. What I remember is Clint's hand tightening around mine, his voice in my ear telling me I could do this, that I had already done the impossible once tonight, and I could do it again. And somewhere in the roaring exhaustion of that final stretch, I found something left in me I hadn't known was still there. The second twin arrived 9 minutes after the first, smaller. Still quieter at first, in a way that made my heart stop entirely, until a long, terrible second later, a thin, indignant cry finally filled the room. And every held breath around me released at once. A girl, this time, and the room, which had been holding its collective breath through those 9 long minutes, seemed to exhale all at once into something like joy. They kept the twins in the neonatal unit for 11 days, small and fierce and stubbornly determined, according to every nurse who cared for them, to prove the doctor's cautious estimates wrong at every turn. I spent those 11 days shuttling between my own hospital bed and the incubators, where our children lay tangled in wires and monitors that looked at first terrifyingly clinical, until I learned to see past them to the small, steadily strengthening bodies underneath. Clint named our son first, standing beside the incubator on that first exhausted morning, his voice thick with an emotion he made no attempt to hide. "Theo," he said. "Theodore Dean." He looked at me for approval, and I nodded, Because it fit, somehow, this small, fierce boy who had announced his arrival to the world with a scream loud enough to make an entire hospital wing take notice. Our daughter, quieter, more watchful, even in those first uncertain days, earned her name from me. "Ren," I said, looking down at her tiny, curled fingers wrapped around one of mine, impossibly small and impossibly strong at once. "Ren Dean." Clint repeated it back like he was testing its weight, and then he smiled the particular smile that had undone me completely on a rain-soaked pier so many months before, and said it fit her perfectly. This small, watchful girl, who had waited those extra 9 minutes like she wanted to be entirely certain the world outside was worth joining. I will not pretend those 11 days were easy. There were moments of terror threaded through every hour, monitors that beeped in ways that sent my heart into my throat, doctors whose careful, measured language sometimes failed to fully mask the seriousness underneath. But there was also threaded through all of it an enormous, overwhelming tenderness watching Clint hold each twin one at a time against his bare chest during the skin-to-skin sessions the nurses encouraged, watching him talk to them in that same low, gentle voice he'd used in our unfinished nursery, all those months before watching 2 entire tiny lives begin slowly to steady and strengthen under the weight of how thoroughly they were already loved. "They're going to be all right," Clint told me on the 7th day, when the doctors had finally begun using words like stable and thriving instead of the careful hedged language of the first uncertain days. "I know it doesn't feel real yet, but they're going to be all right, and so are you, and I need you to hear that, because I don't think you've let yourself believe it yet." He was right, of course. He usually was, about the things that mattered most. It took me longer than those 11 days to fully believe the twins were safe, longer still to believe that I myself had made it through something so many people had quietly, gently warned me might not go the way I hoped. But standing there in that hospital room watching Clint hold our daughter against his chest while our son slept in the incubator beside them, I felt something in my chest finally begin to loosen. Some fear I had been carrying since long before I'd even known I was pregnant, easing its grip at last. We brought them home on a bright, cold morning in early spring, the kind of morning that felt, in its clean, sharp light, like the whole world had been freshly made just for the occasion. The nursery I had rearranged 3 times over in my nesting-driven frenzy finally had its true purpose. 2 small forms settled into the cribs I had positioned and repositioned so many times, finally exactly where they belonged. The first weeks at home were a blur of exhaustion, unlike anything either of us had ever experienced. The particular sleepless chaos of caring for 2 newborns at once, feedings that overlapped, cries that echoed each other across the small distance of the nursery, an endless cycle of diapers and soothing and the desperate, precious few hours of sleep either of us managed to grab in the gaps between. But there were moments, even in the depths of that exhaustion, that I knew, even as they were happening, I would carry with me for the rest of my life. Clint, half asleep in the rocking chair at 3 in the morning. Theo settled against his chest, humming some tuneless, made-up melody under his breath because he'd read somewhere that the sound of a parent's voice could soothe a fussy infant, and it apparently didn't matter that he couldn't carry a tune to save his life. Ren, watchful even as an infant, tracking her father's face across the room with an intensity that made the nurses at her checkups comment more than once on how alert she seemed for her age. "Do you ever think about that night on the pier?" I asked him one particularly quiet evening, both twins finally asleep at the same time, a small miracle we had learned not to take for granted. We were sitting together on the couch, my head against his shoulder, too tired to do much beyond exist quietly in each other's company. "All the time," he said. "I think about how close I came to just riding right past you. If I'd been paying attention to where I was going instead of wherever my head was that night, I might have missed you entirely. But you didn't." "No," he agreed, pressing a kiss into my hair. "I didn't. Best mistake I ever made, not watching where I was going. I thought in that quiet moment about everything that had led us here. From a rain-soaked pier to a torn bait shop receipt, to a locked bedroom door during my worst heat, to a starlit meadow where we bonded under a sky full of falling stars. From the terror of that first ultrasound to the impossible joy of learning we would have not one child but two, from the fear of preterm labor to the fierce hard-won relief of two healthy, thriving babies finally sleeping soundly in the next room. I thought about how rare all of this had been statistically, biologically. In every measurable way, the world had tried to warn me about since I was old enough to understand what my own body was and wasn't likely to do. And I thought about how none of those numbers, none of those careful, cautious warnings had prepared me for how it would actually feel to be loved. This completely, to love, in return, this fiercely. To hold two entire new lives in my arms and know with a certainty that went bone deep that every hard moment along the way had been worth this exact ending. I love you, I told Clint, simple and unguarded, the way I had learned, slowly, over years, to say the things that mattered most without armor around them. I love you too, he said, and then glancing toward the closed nursery door, added with the particular soft wonder that had become a permanent fixture in his voice since the twins arrived. I love all three of you. More than I think I really knew how to love anything before you all came into my life. Outside, the spring evening deepened slowly into night, and somewhere beyond the window, the world went on in its ordinary way, entirely unaware of the small, extraordinary miracle unfolding in this one quiet house. Two rare, precious lives sleeping soundly down the hall, and the two of us finally, fully, unshakably a family, exactly the way I had once been warned, gently not to hope for too much. I had hoped anyway. And it had been, in every possible way, worth every risk. Theo and Ren turned one on a warm afternoon in early summer, the whole yard strung with the same kind of lights Clint's sister had hung for our wedding, because some things, we'd both agreed, were worth repeating. Theo took his first wobbling steps that very afternoon straight into his father's waiting arms, while Ren watched from my lap with the same careful assessing gaze she'd worn since the day she was born, as though she were simply waiting for the right moment to decide walking was worth the effort herself. My mother cried, predictably, blaming the onions from the barbecue for reasons no one at the party actually believed. Clint's parents held their grandchildren in turn with an unhurried, contented joy that filled something in me I hadn't fully realized had been empty for most of my life, some old ache about family and belonging that had slowly, entirely dissolved. Late that evening, once the guests had gone and the twins had finally, blessedly fallen asleep, Clint and I sat together on the back steps, watching the last of the light fade from the sky, his arm around my shoulders, my head resting against him the way it had rested against him on so many nights before, going all the way back to a truck tailgate outside my old apartment, going all the way back, if I let myself trace it far enough, to a rain-soaked pier and a bicycle that very nearly ran me over. Any regrets? He asked, half teasing, the way he sometimes did when he already knew the answer and just wanted to hear me say it out loud anyway. Only that it took you so long to notice me at that wedding, I said. All those hours we could have been talking instead of you just staring at me from across a crowded reception like some kind of creep. I was working up my courage, he said, entirely unbothered by the accusation. Some things are worth taking your time on. You took your time on everything. And look how it turned out, he said, gesturing toward the house behind us, toward the nursery where our children slept, toward the whole quiet, ordinary, extraordinary life we had built together, one patient, deliberate choice at a time. I looked, and I saw everything I had once been warned not to hope for too hard, sitting solid and real, and entirely mine. And I thought, watching the stars come out slowly over the ranch that had become our home, that some risks were always worth taking, no matter how rare the odds, no matter how many careful voices along the way had counseled caution. I had been told, my whole life, not to build my future around a maybe. I had built it anyway, on a maybe that turned into a certainty, on a rare, impossible gift that had become, in the end, the truest, steadiest thing in my entire life. Clint Dean had not walked away from a rain-soaked stranger on a pier all those years ago, and I have spent every day since being endlessly, achingly grateful that he didn't. Some maybes, it turns out, are worth every single risk. There is a photograph on our mantle now taken by Clint's sister at that first birthday party, the four of us caught mid-laugh in the golden light of early evening. Theo reaching for the camera with both fists, Ren watching it with her usual careful suspicion. Clint's arm around my shoulders and my head tipped back against him. I look at that photograph some mornings before the twins wake, before the whole loud, wonderful chaos of the day begins, and I try to find the version of myself who stood alone on a rain-soaked pier. Certain that hope was a currency I couldn't afford to spend. I can still find her, that version of me, if I look closely enough. She is still in there, somewhere underneath everything that came after. The careful, guarded person who had built an entire life around not wanting too much. I don't think she ever fully goes away. Not for any of us who grew up being told our biology was a maybe and not a promise. But she is quieter now. She has been answered in the particular loud, insistent way that two small children and one steady patient man have a way of answering old fears simply by being present morning after morning, proof stacked on proof. Until the fear no longer has anywhere left to stand. Dr. Alvarez still checks in on us sometimes, more out of genuine fondness than medical necessity at this point, and she told me once, not long after the twins turned 1, that our case had become something of a quiet legend among the other doctors at her practice, whispered about the way people whisper about lightning striking twice, a rare thing made rarer still. I think about that sometimes, how strange it is to be a footnote in someone else's professional wonder, and how little that rarity actually mattered in the end, compared to the ordinary miracle of two small hands reaching for me every morning, certain without needing to be told that I would be there to catch them. Theo is loud. It turns out, in every sense of the word, quick to laugh and quick to cry, and entirely unbothered by either moving through the world with an ease that reminds me more with every passing month of his father. Ren remains watchful, careful, the kind of child who studies a room before she decides to join it, and there are days I catch her looking at me with an expression so knowing, so entirely her own person already, that it takes my breath away to remember she has not yet been alive a full 2 years. Clint still meets me some evenings at the bookstore, though I work fewer hours there now, sitting on the front step, the same way he did in those very first weeks. Except now, there are two small people tucked against him, one on each knee, waiting for me to lock up and come home. I think some nights watching him from across the darkened shop, that if I could send some message back through time to the version of myself standing alone on that pier, soaked through and certain that nothing good was coming for her, I would tell her only this: stay standing in the rain a little longer. Someone is about to nearly run you over, and it is going to be the best thing that ever happens to you. If you made it to the end, you're my kind of person. Leave a subscribe, comment down your favorite part of the story, and if you want early access to videos, exclusive content, or just want to support the channel, make sure to join our Patreon, link is in the description. Even one member genuinely means the world to me. See you in the next one.